Hello, I'm Tom Gregory with Youngstown Christian Television. Thanks for joining us on the YouTube channel here and watching the program that you're about to see. Before you do that, if you could hit the subscribe button and join us, that way you'll always be informed of what's going on with Youngstown Christian Television every time we put a new video up on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.
Welcome to Discovering His Story, a featured program of Youngstown Christian Television. In our program, we're going to be looking at history from a biblical perspective. In these programs, we will endeavor to investigate what has taken place over the centuries with a view to observing how God was working out His plan for the ages. This certainly will include examining biblical events and people to witness how they interact with what we know of extra-biblical history. But also will include a perspective on how God accomplished His will during times outside of the biblical record. We'll be covering a lot of territory, and so we cannot do so exhaustively. There will be areas of the world that will not be addressed, and I will share what I have researched regarding how God has been working to the best of my ability. But I cannot claim to be an expert in every area and every part of the historical record. Any errors that I make are not intentional, and I welcome your feedback. Some of you may have stumbled upon our program by accident, and so I want to bring to your attention just why we should study history. Let me just put it in one statement by Cicero, that ancient Greek philosopher. He said this: "He who knows only his own generations remains forever a child." And this is particularly important for those of us that follow Christ, because we desire to know what God is doing and has been doing in the world over the centuries. It helps us to understand Him better, as well as understand ourselves and what God has been doing through many, many people who have been following Him. Now, the first section of history that we're going to be examining, we are entitling Ancient Times. And so we're going to be examining the historical record of ancient times and of going on back to the very beginning. In examining the historical record, we must be familiar with the time designations used in defining when things occurred. All of you are familiar with the designations BC and AD. Most of you probably know that BC stands for before Christ, although I have come across some who think that AD stands for after death, but that's not true. It really is the Latin term Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. When we're looking at the terms BC and AD, we need to keep in mind that as we start with the years that are given to us here, we see the years 1 through 99, and then move up to 100 to 199, and so on after the birth of Christ. And then as we go into the BC area, we see that we go backwards. The year 1 and then to 99 makes it an older time. Now, the old offensive timeline is done away with by modern scholars. They no longer like before Christ and Anno Domini because, well, it has the name Jesus Christ in it, and so we can't have that. So the politically correct timeline is now to call it BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era. And although some of the materials that I present may have those designations, they are not ones that I use myself. And so I will commonly refer to years as being BC and AD. Now, one of the things that might be confusing is considering centuries. I know that as an elementary student, I had difficulty with that from the very beginning. There was a time when I had to figure out that the 1900s weren't the 19th century. Actually, the 1900s is designated as the 20th century. And now that we're in the 2000s, we're in the 21st century. And so we remember that for AD, but it's also true of BC. If you look on the chart here, you can see that the first century is from the years 1 through 100. That's the first century. Then when we get to the 100s, that's actually the second century. And then we get to the 200s, that's the third century, and so on. So when we talk about something happening in the second century BC, that would be in the 100s. Just like if we're talking about second century AD, it's in the 100s as well. It's just a difference between BC and AD in that BC, the numbers go backwards. So what happens sometimes is you'll see a person being born and dying, and you'll look at that and think, wait a minute, the numbers indicate that he died before he was born. No, it's just because the numbers go backwards when we're looking at BC. Now, one of the things you have to keep in mind if you are wanting to purchase anything from those time periods, that if someone offers you a coin and it says BC on it, that is not something you'll want to invest in. The people that lived there didn't know they were living in BC. So these are numbers that are arbitrarily, in a sense, assigned to those different time periods. All right, so with that out of the way, we need to ask our question, where shall we begin? You know, as the famous song says, we begin at the beginning. But what is the beginning? That in itself is controversial. Everyone's approach is, in fact, determined by their presuppositions. I will tell you up front that my presupposition is that the biblical record is accurate. So in determining the beginning, I believe that the biblical record indicates that we need only go back 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. In addition to the accounts of the book of Genesis, there are many evidences in the physical world that indicate that we are indeed living on a young earth. I would like to summarize a presentation by Dr. Russell Humphreys, who has a PhD and is the ICR Associate Professor of Physics. He entitled this presentation, Evidence for a Young World. And I'd like to go through some of that with you to give you an extra biblical perspective or evidence for the fact that we are indeed living in a relatively young universe. He points out 14 natural phenomena, out of which, many of which conflict with the evolutionary idea that the universe is billions of years old. First, the fact that galaxies wind themselves up too fast. The stars of our own galaxy, the Milky Way, rotate about the galactic center with different speeds, the inner ones rotating faster than the outer ones. The observed rotation speeds are so fast that if our galaxy were more than a few 100 million years old, it would be a featureless disk of stars instead of its present spiral shape. Yet our galaxy is supposed to be at least 10 billion years old. Evolutionists call this the winding up dilemma, which they have known about for 50 years. They have devised many theories and tried to explain it, but each one fails after a brief period of popularity. The second item is that there are too few supernova remnants. According to astronomical observations, galaxies like our own experience about one supernova, that is, a violently exploding star, every 25 years. The gas and dust remnants from such explosions, like the Crab Nebula shown here, expand outward rapidly and should remain visible for over 1 million years. Yet the nearby parts of our galaxy in which we could observe such gas and dust shells contain only about 200 supernova remnants. That number is consistent with only about 7,000 years worth of supernovas. Next, the comets disintegrate too quickly. According to evolutionary theory, comets are supposed to be the same age as the solar system, about 5 billion years old. Yet each time a comet orbits close to the Sun, it loses so much of its material that it could not survive much longer than about 100,000 years. Many comets have typical ages of less than 10,000 years. Some evolutionists explain this discrepancy by assuming that comets come from an unobserved spherical Oort cloud, well beyond the orbit of Pluto. Lately, there's been much talk of the Kuiper Belt, a disk of supposed comet sources lying in the plane of the solar system just outside the orbit of Pluto. Some asteroid-sized bodies of ice exist in that location, but they do not solve the evolutionist problem, since according to evolutionary theory, the Kuiper Belt would quickly become exhausted if there were no Oort cloud to supply it. So far, none of these assumptions has been substantiated either by observations or realistic calculations. Here's another idea about the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud. Again, there is no substantiation, no evidence that they really exist. The next item that indicates a young Earth is that there's not enough mud on the seafloor. Each year, water and winds erode about 20 billion tons of dirt and rock from the continents and deposit it in the ocean. This material accumulates as loose sediment on the hard basalt, that is the lava-formed rock of the ocean floor. The average depth of all the sediment in the whole ocean is less than 400 meters. The main way known to remove the sediment from the ocean floor is by plate tectonic subduction. That is, sea floor slides slowly, a few centimeters a year, beneath the continents, taking some sediment with it. According to secular scientific literature, that process presently removes only 1 billion tons per year. As far as anyone knows, the other 19 billion tons per year simply accumulate. At that rate, erosion would deposit the present mass of sediment in less than 12 million years. Yet, according to evolutionary theory, erosion and plate subduction have been going on as long as the oceans have existed, an alleged 3 billion years. If that were so, the rates above imply that the oceans would be massively choked with sediment dozens of kilometers deep. The alternative creationist explanation is that erosion from the waters of the Genesis flood running off the continents deposited the present amount of sediment within a short time, about 5,000 years ago. Next, we have the idea that there is not enough sodium in the sea. Every year, rivers and other sources dump over 450 million tons of sodium into the ocean. Only 25% of this sodium manages to get back out of the sea each year. As far as anyone knows, the remainder simply accumulates in the ocean. If the sea had no sodium to start with, it would have accumulated its present amount in less than 42 million years at today's input and output rates. This is much less than the evolutionary age of the ocean, 3 billion years. The usual reply to this discrepancy is that past sodium inputs must have been less and outputs greater. However, calculations that are as generous as possible to evolutionary scenarios still give a maximum age of only 62 million years. Calculations for many other seawater elements give much younger ages for the ocean. The next evidence for a young Earth is that the Earth's magnetic field is decaying too fast. Electrical resistance in the Earth's core wears down the electrical current which produces the Earth's magnetic field. This causes the field to lose energy rapidly. The total energy stored in the Earth's magnetic field is decreasing. The rate at which the magnetic field is decaying projects back to a point no more than 20,000 years ago for its greatest strength. At that point of strength, no life would be possible. And so the magnetic field cannot be older than 20,000 years at the very most. The next evidence for a young Earth is that many strata are too tightly bent. In many mountainous areas, and you've probably passed by these areas traveling around, the strata that is thousands of feet thick are bent and folded, like you see in the picture here, into hairpin shapes. The conventional geologic time scale says that these formations were deeply buried and solidified for hundreds of millions of years before they were bent. Yet the folding occurred without cracking, with radii so small that the entire formation had to be still wet and unsolidified when the bending occurred. This implies that the folding occurred less than thousands of years after deposition. Take a look as you're driving along mountainous areas, and you'll see that these strata are bent, not straight, as the evolutionists would have us think. The next evidence is that biological material decays too fast. Natural radioactivity, mutations, and decay degrade DNA and other biological material rapidly. Measurements of the mutation rate of mitochondrial DNA recently forced researchers to revise the age of mitochondrial Eve, that is, the most recent woman from whom all living humans descend in an unbroken line purely through their mothers and through the mothers of those mothers, back until all lines converge on one woman. They go back as much as 200,000 years, down to possibly as low as 6,000 years. DNA experts insist that DNA cannot exist in natural environments longer than 10,000 years. Yet intact strands of DNA appear to have been recovered from fossils allegedly much older. Neanderthal bones, insects in amber, and even from dinosaur fossils. Bacteria allegedly 250 million years old apparently have been revived with no DNA damage. Soft tissue and blood cells from a dinosaur have astonished experts. The ninth evidence for a young Earth is that fossil radioactivity shortens geologic ages to a few years. Radio halos, as pictured here, are rings of color formed around microscopic bits of radioactive minerals in rock crystals. They are fossil evidence of radioactive decay. Squashed polonium-210 radiohalos indicate that Jurassic, Triassic, and Eocene formations in the Colorado Plateau were deposited within months of one another, not hundreds of millions of years apart as required by the conventional timescale. The 10th evidence of a young Earth is that there's too much helium in minerals. Uranium and thorium generate helium atoms as they decay to lead. A study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research showed that such helium produced in zircon crystals in deep, hot Precambrian granitic rock has not had time to escape. Though the rocks contain 1.5 billion years worth of nuclear decay products, newly measured rates of helium loss from zircon showed that the helium has been leaking for only 6,000, give or take 2,000 years. The 11th evidence for a young Earth is that there's too much carbon-14 in deep geologic strata. With their short 5,700-year half-life, no carbon-14 should exist in any carbon older than 250,000 years. Yet it is proven impossible to find any natural source of carbon below Pleistocene or Ice Age strata that does not contain significant amounts of carbon-14, even though such strata are supposed to be millions or billions of years old. Conventional carbon-14 laboratories have been aware of this anomaly since the early 1980s, have striven to eliminate it, and are unable to account for it. These constitute very strong evidence that the Earth is only thousands, not billions, of years old. The 12th evidence for a young Earth is that there are not enough Stone Age skeletons. Evolutionary anthropologists now say that Homo sapiens existed for at least 185,000 years before agriculture began, during which time the world population of humans was roughly constant, between 1 and 10 million. All that time they were burying their dead, often with artifacts. By that scenario, they would have buried at least 8 billion bodies. If the evolutionary timescale is correct, buried bones should be able to last for much longer than 200,000 years. So many of the supposed 8 billion Stone Age skeletons should still be around, and certainly the buried artifacts. Yet only a few thousand have been found. This implies that the Stone Age was much shorter than evolutionists think, perhaps only a few hundred years in many areas. The 13th evidence for a young Earth is that agriculture is too recent. The usual evolutionary picture has men existing as hunters and gatherers for 185,000 years during the Stone Age, before discovering agriculture less than 10,000 years ago. Yet the archaeological evidence shows that Stone Age men were as intelligent as we are. It is very improbable that none of the 8 billion people mentioned in item 12 should discover that plants grow from seeds. It is more likely that men were without agriculture for a very short time after the flood, if at all. And lastly, the 14th evidence for young Earth is that history is too short. According to evolutionists, Stone Age Homo sapiens existed for 190,000 years before beginning to make written records about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. By the way, notice that all of the indications of men writing and having agriculture fit very closely to what we believe the biblical record indicates. And so we're to believe that prehistoric man built megalithic monuments, made beautiful cave paintings, and kept records of lunar phases. Why would we wait 2,000 centuries before applying the same skills to record history? It doesn't make any sense. The biblical timescale is much more likely. So looking back over what we've covered today, we've presented 14 natural phenomena which conflict with the evolutionary idea that the universe is billions of years old. So that gives us a starting point when we're looking at history or telling his story. Next time we're going to look at the ideas of prehistoric times. What were they? What should we call that time period? What do we know about that time period that is called prehistory? Now today's presentation was a little bit technical, and I understand that some of you may not have found it as particularly interesting as others. But I assure you that if you tune in next time, you'll find things that are very interesting, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. So come next time, tune in next time on Youngstown Christian Television for our next installment of Discovering His Story, and we'll be looking at prehistoric times. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you again next week.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story. Okay, tax time again. What's it going to cost me this year? Well, that seems high. That's a lot more than I thought. Is everyone this expensive? Here's a local company. Let's check them out. They've been around for 15 years. Average fee less than $79. I'm going to Tax 29. They have an office near me.